This is Puzzle Corner capsule number one, I suppose we can call it. It's not really an episode, but I had the good fortune of meeting somebody who I only knew from his voice from the great show Ask Me Another, Ophira Eisenberg. And this gentleman was the puzzle master on that discontinued NPR show. So we got to chatting, and he's like super interested in trivia and did a bunch of research and stumped me with some questions. So this is the great Art Chung.
Hi.
Hello, Art.
Hi. Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me. I mean, it's been a while. And actually, we like to say that Will Shortz is the only puzzle master and that we were puzzle gurus. So
Okay,
it was
fair enough.
trademark.
I like
um,
that.
but yeah, when we started talking, and I've, been a great jazz fan all my life. But in my history of writing trivia, both for NPR and other places, there hasn't, jazz is a little tricky. There are artists and albums and things that a lot of people know, but it can also get very esoteric very quickly. And so I had some fun thinking of questions that would work for you and for a larger audience. I think particularly, I was just kind of interested in getting the sense of what is a hard question? What is a hard jazz trivia question versus
Mm,
other questions? So um,
wow.
initially, you gave me a couple of different topics, and one of them was musicians in Miles Davis bands, and so I thought that was great. Because I'm a huge Miles Davis fan.
Maybe
B,
maybe I gave you that topic because it would be easier for me.
oh, well, great, and that works out both ways.
Go
Um,
ahead. Sorry.
but also, from a trivia standpoint, Miles is someone that even if you don't know who was in his bands, you know him, and so that's kind of interesting. So, one of the first questions I had thrown at you was about the first Miles Davis quintet, and they had two legendary recording sessions on May 11th and October 26th, 1956.
Oh, we're going right into it here.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's go right into it. And that resulted in four classic albums with very similar titles. And so I asked you if you could name the four albums. And how did you do?
Yeah, I must be honest. I cannot tell a lie. I got 3 out of 4. I couldn't come up with the fourth one.
Which were the three that you got? Let's see. You
I think
got,
I got cooking, steaming, and working.
right.
And the last one I couldn't get. And of course, these are incredible and seminal, important, formative records for me, but for almost anyone that plays this music. The last one, I finally looked it up and I could have, you know, stupid. But the last one, of course, is relaxing. And
Right.
a lot of people listening to this probably got all four right away.
Hmm.
But I feel like trying to think back, what would the band have been? What was happening in 1956? Why did Miles Davis make 4 albums in such a short amount of time? How did that all come about? Is piecing that together ought to be able to give you at least a few of the titles. So, but you can also Google them, I suppose.
Well, I think what's fun from my perspective was, and I think I have Workin was it's an amazing fact in and of itself. And it turns out, those albums were released from 1957 to 1961. So they really got a lot of mileage from those recording sessions.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And that was intentional
Hmm.
because he was leaving, it was prestige, and he was getting ready to get signed by Columbia, which was a bigger platform for him.
Hmm.
And so as an agreement to let me knock out my remaining contractual albums so I can move on to this new relationship.
Oh, see, that's a great context for that. And you had said when we were discussing that question that when you asked younger musicians, they had no idea.
I did in my travels. I ran into a group of um, yeah, musicians younger than myself, and I asked them this, and yeah, it was blank stare. So
Was it they had never heard of the albums and that's not how they consume the songs? Because that speaks to me
maybe
of yeah.
Art. I didn't go that deep with them really.
Mm,
It was a brief interaction. If I see him again, I'll ask him. But that's the thing about trivia. Like maybe trivia is the wrong word, but this kind of historical information, if you don't know it, it's hard to know why you don't know it.
Right, right, right. That's exactly the point I was going to make, was that generationally, I mean, maybe these albums aren't, they're not as well known as Kind of Blue. They may not have listened to the songs or the albums, or they're not consuming them as an album. They
I
literally
think
don't
that's
never seen
probably
them.
closer to what it is. Yeah.
Hmm. And it's interesting because I do think of great jazz album, but maybe that's no longer the case. So that's fascinating.
Well, these are great albums.
Yeah,
These are
no, they're
great.
great albums. Also,
Yeah.
just funny. Like the names are just funny. Like what is working with, or steaming with the Miles Davis quintet. So my second question was about this transition from the first grade quintet, as they call it, to the second grade quintet. I mean, this is on Wikipedia. Do people actually call them the second grade quintet, or the
Oh,
eras?
yes.
Yes.
Oh, very much. Yes.
Hmm. Just kind of looking at the connections, I was kind of interested. I hadn't really thought of it, but Miles just basically changed his whole team, right? Like, except for, well, that he's gone through various eras and worked with a lot of great jazz musicians, and also I think changed musical styles too in some way. So the question I had for you was, who is the only member of Davis's second great quintet to also play on Bitches Brew?
Aha.
And we'll give people a couple seconds.
Yeah. I'd have to think not too long, but you know, I mean, I know the answer to this one because it's one of the most important musicians for me in my musical life. But I could think of at least two others who might have been involved in both. But because of the way you're asking the question, I know that it's only the one that I'm thinking of. Can I say the answer
Sure,
now?
yeah. Hmm.
Oh, well, it's Wayne Shorter,
Yes.
the saxophonist. Yeah.
um, and do you have any context for why he was the only one? Why did he play in Bitches Brew?
Well, oh, that's very subjective. I mean, I wouldn't presume to really know, but my guess would be that they recorded a couple of his compositions.
Hmm.
Also, that at that time, he was the only other horn player that had that kind of rapport with Miles Davis, um, in terms of playing melodies together and understanding what was the ensemble playing context that
Hmm.
was expected. But also, the other members of the so-called second great quintet had sort of been moving on to their own projects, and Wayne Shorter was about to form Weather Report with Joe Zawinul, but it hadn't quite happened yet when those sessions happened.
Hmm.
So I think all of that probably went into it. I
Hmm.
think that, as you said before, Miles Davis moved through a lot of different ways of playing and different musicians. And I think that this would have been 68, 69. There hadn't been another saxophonist quite yet who had appeared.
Hmm.
It was soon after that there were many others. But
Hmm.
from about 64, 65 until this time, Wayne Shorter was pretty much the only person that had been playing in those ensembles.
Mm, interesting. Great. See, that's the kind of stuff that I don't know. I can tell you the trivia, but I don't have the context for that kind of stuff. Well, there was one more question that I thought was fun that we had asked was, and just kind of doing research. Jazz musicians often have colorful histories and lives, and looking through Kind of Blue, we got to Julian Adderley, commonly known as Cannonball,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
I'd asked you if you knew why he was called Cannonball.
Right. And I didn't. I mean,
You had a good guess.
I would have guessed, body type, shape,
He was
but
a large, yeah.
he was perfect.
Mhm.
But it turns out, and then after you asked me, I sort of walked around thinking about it for a few days, and then I gave in and looked it up online. And so it turns out that when he was a kid, he had a voracious appetite and they called him Cannibal. And then it got mispronounced and became Cannonball. And that was how the, so there's probably people out there that knew that, but I didn't know that.
That's what I love about trivia too. It's just sort of like Cannonball sounds like it's a fun nickname, but then
Yeah.
when you realize that it's like, oh, they just, it was like a weird pronunciation of cannibal, then it's even funnier and more notable. So I
Well,
really enjoyed
also
that.
that in jazz, so many of the nicknames were about royalty, count
Mhm.
and duke and captain, and so suddenly out of the blue, there's this one person whose nickname is Cannonball. Seems kind of
Did you ever
wonderful.
aspire to have a nickname, or did anyone ever give you a nickname?
Oh, I've had a few, but yeah,
None that can be repeated.
leave it at that for now. This is only our first capsule.
Oh, we'll get some more trivia from you later. The Dave Douglas trivia will be very tricky.
Okay.
But maybe not for you. I had a lot of fun coming up with those questions, and I think was optimistic that there would be fun questions throughout. So I'm looking forward to, if we do this again, to having more topics, even listener questions, suggestions about what they want to hear about. But I wanted to leave you with one question, because that's always a good thing to do.
And I just want to say that for people that are hearing this particular episode, Art made this question for you. So we're going to put it out there and not answer it. And you can email us. It's podcast@greenleafmusic.com. You could record a voice memo and send it in your email, or you could just type in the body of the email. But we would love to hear from you and take your wild or not so wild guesses as to what the answer to this is. All right. So what's
All
the
right.
question, Art?
Well, in doing the research for Kind of Blue, I was just kind of curious how famous, or well, how well known it is. And you might know that Kind of Blue is the best-selling instrumental jazz album of all time, but only probably after it was re-released. I mean, it did well, but it's a 5 times multi-platinum album according to the Recording Industry Association of America. Um, but it's not the best-selling jazz album of all time. That is certified 12 times platinum. So that's, I think, 12 million copies. So what is the best-selling jazz album of all time?
Wow.
And I'll give you a hint. When I described Kind of Blue, I qualified that a little bit, because I said it's the best-selling instrumental jazz album of all time.
Aha. Heck of a hint.
It is a big hint. And then there's an amusing side question of like, what is jazz? And
Oh, not so amusing for a lot of people, but go ahead.
there is also what is the best-selling jazz adjacent album of all time, which also has more than 12 million copies. It is something that I think people would argue is or is not jazz.
But it's jazz adjacent.
Yes. And so we can discuss that next time, of like whether when you hear the answer, will you be like, yes, that is a jazz artist and the jazz album, or that is not a jazz album?
So I don't know the answer to either of these.
Nice.
Uh,
Mhm.
and you've given good clues. So I'm going to try to stay away from Wikipedia and really think about it. So the first one is
Well, there are two albums which have sold over 12 million copies.
right.
One is more considered a jazz album, pretty
Right.
much
One
straightforward.
is like by the more general description of what jazz
Yeah.
is as a
Mhm.
genre.
As a genre, right?
I would assume, the artist is somebody who we would quite famously associate with being a jazz musician.
Yes. And then there's another album that is less more controversially described as a jazz album.
And probably more modern, more recent, I would
Yes,
guess.
yes, yes.
Okay. All right. I hope we get some responses. I'll be really interested. Jazz adjacent is a funny phrase that'll strike a lot of people as argumentative, and that's fine. Yeah, really great. Thanks for
Great.
doing this.
Sure. Looking forward to hearing the responses, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, fantastic. The great Art Chung, Puzzle Guru.